Adoption, the idea that is smiled upon and thought of as a good idea for children who need a loving family. But when the challenges start, some parents might quit or give up during the adoption process. According to Home for Every Child, there are more than 20 million children, orphans, that are waiting to be adopted. In 2005, my sister Valerie and I would become part of that statistic number. I have two very important guests in the studio today that lowered that number by 2 children and changed my sisters and my life forever. These 2 people are my parents, Kevin and Elizabeth Brooks, or as I know them, Mom and Dad. Welcome to the studio. Before we get into our family's adoption story, can both of you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and then go on to let the listeners know if adopting children was something that you both talked or even thought about before you adopted Valerie and me?
Okay, this is Kevin, the dad. I love farm life, and I work in agriculture and always have since I was old enough to drive a tractor, growing up on a farm in Iowa. Professionally, today I manage farms and also work for University of Illinois Extension, where I teach farmers and landowners about farm management.
My name is Betsy. I'm the mom. I always wanted to be a mom and a nurse, and those are 2 things that I achieved very well. With the adoption of Olivia and Valerie, we ended up with 6 children. And I also have worked as a nurse. Many of those years I was a full-time mother, but I also spent 14 years working as a nurse in maternal child health, which means labor, delivery, postpartum, pregnancy, and I worked in pediatrics.
And then was adoption something that you both talked or even thought about before?
Yes, we talked about it. We actually talked about it quite a bit over the years, just thinking about what we could do to help make the world a better place. It was a bit maybe naive, but it was a thought that we had, and I would bring it up once in a while and see how Betsy felt about it. And the situation eventually presented itself, and so here we are.
So we had 3 boys and 1 daughter. And our 1 daughter, Jessica, was not happy being the only girl in the family. Every night, as I put her to sleep, she let me know, I want sisters. She loved her brothers, but she always wanted sisters, and she was always encouraging adoption for us.
So, Dad, let's start with letting the listeners know why you went to Ukraine, and then let the listeners know how you first met my sister Valerie and me.
Well, as a boy growing up in the Cold War, I was fascinated by the Soviet Union, our so-called enemy. And as I advanced in my career, some opportunities came open to volunteer for some USAID projects, legitimate projects. It's been in the news a lot lately. And so I had the opportunity to go to Ukraine for helping farmers become better farmers. These were generally small farmers. In the rural areas, a lot of the men had disappeared either through alcoholism and early death or left for other countries where there were more economic opportunities. But I went there as they were trying to rebuild the economy from the collapse after the Soviet Union fell. And that's what got me started there with USAID. It eventually moved to working with universities and actual farmers and bringing them over here to learn about United States technology. But that's how I got started with it, was with USAID.
And how did you meet me? I know you met me first, so you can tell a little bit how you did that, but then go on to at least let the listeners know how you met my sister Valerie.
As mentioned by Betsy, our daughter Jessica was interested in children and particularly orphanages. I think in the back of her mind, she was still thinking, maybe I can get some sisters at some point. But knowing that I was going over on, I think it was my second project in Ukraine, she had gone to garage sales and gathered up clothing and bought a suitcase and put the clothes in a suitcase for me to take to Ukraine to drop off at a Ukrainian orphanage. And I carted that around for several weeks as I was going about the countryside, and I finally talked to one of the Ukrainians that I was working with and said, hey, I can't go back to the United States with these clothes. I got to be able to say that I dropped them off at an orphanage. Can you please arrange that for me? And he did. And it was a transitional orphanage where the children who had either lost their parents or were taken into state custody because of abuse and neglect. It was a facility, again, where they would transition to another facility eventually, and they were doing a rehearsal for International Children's Day where they were going to put on a play for the public in a musical. And Olia was too little to participate in that, and so she was standing around the side. She was right about 3 years old at the time, and I'm taking pictures and listening and had my camera out, and she was fascinated with my camera. And here was this child with, as one person described, these big, beautiful, somewhat sad eyes, kept coming up to me and was very inquisitive, and some people might call it pestering, but she wanted to handle my camera, which I let her, and interacting with me, and we kind of hit it off. That was the first time we met.
Mom, what was your reaction when Dad came home and said, there's this little girl, I truly think this is something God wants us to do? How did you feel about it?
Okay, so I had been a stay-at-home mom for a long time, and I had just gone back to work at Carl's, and I was working pediatric clinic. And Kevin came back, and he said to me, there's this little girl. I think God wants us to adopt her. And my initial reaction was, I've just gone back to work. I'd like to try to get my work life established. I had just been working a few months. And then he told me, I really feel like God is behind this. He's really spoken to me on this one, Betsy. So I said, okay, I am not going to argue with God. If this is something God is telling you to do, then I'm all in. And Kevin was willing to do all the paperwork and get it all done, and make it, not a lot of work for me as I was transitioning back into the workforce.
So obviously you met me first, but in the middle of the adoption process, my sister comes into the picture, Valerie. How did that happen?
Well, the whole process wasn't a smooth, straight line to where everything just fell into place. Originally, when I was going back to the U.S., I boarded a plane from Kyiv back to someplace in Western Europe. I'm not sure where it was at this point. I'd have to think about that. But there was a family taking a small child back to the United States for medical care, and it was apparent that you had some medical needs, and I thought that might be a first step to at least let's see if we can get her some help. And we ran into problems getting Olia out of the country for treatment and such. So then that began the process of adoption. We did lose track of her during the process as she was moved from the transitional orphanage to another orphanage, and it seemed like nobody knew exactly where she was. And I put out some messages to people that I knew in the country, and they were able to locate her and then said, hey, by the way, there's a sister there, Valerie, today with her American name, and found out she had a sister. So it then became an endeavor to adopt 2 children, which the amount of paperwork for it is immense, but I guess in some ways we got, in some ways, 2 for almost the price of 1 in terms of the effort. But it was a lot of effort. As we know now, there's a war going on in Ukraine, and that actually has a history going back 20 years with unrest and politics between pro-West political forces and pro-Russian, and there were demonstrations going on. It looked like there was a civil war going to break out during this time.
Adoption and or placing a child up for adoption is a big journey for everyone who goes through it. If you want to adopt a child or place a child up for adoption, the Adoption Center of Illinois is here to help. The center is not just here to help with the process and during the process, but they also support parents after the adoption process. You can reach out by going to their website at www.adoptioncenterofillinois.org or call at 773-334-2300 to get more information. We are back to hearing more of the adoption story that Kevin and Elizabeth Brooks are telling me.
And I had the paperwork in, that all came up, and then by the time things got settled to where we could proceed with the adoption, the paperwork had expired, so we had to do that twice. So it was an endeavor.
Yeah, absolutely. Sounds like it. Mom and Dad, you both have and had 4 other kids before you started the adoption process. How did you prepare yourself and your family for adoption?
Well, our oldest son, David, was right before the Valerie and Olivia. At that time, they were Olya and Valia. We were required to come up with American names, and we just chose names that were very close to their Ukrainian names. We would not have been allowed to adopt without names. But David was going off to his first year at the University of Illinois. So we had 3 children still in the home, and our home was not a large home, 1,500 square feet. In fact, we were technically only allowed to add 1 more child into our home based on the dimensions of our home. And so the agency that we were working with came back to our home and remeasured our home and just added in the garage as if it was square footage, living space, which it wasn't. So we were kind of, when they came in, they were packed in like sardines. Kind of 3 girls in a room 10 by 11. Valerie and Olivia were exceedingly comfortable in that situation, and I really don't know that we could have ever prepared their older sister for the change in her life. She had had a room all to herself. She wanted these girls so much, yet having 2 more girls in her room, that was an adjustment. She was so happy to have them, yet they were very inquisitive, getting into her stuff, and it actually led to some difficulties, some difficult moments as Jessica had to adjust. Valia and Olya were very actually easygoing. They were not difficult children from the get-go. They were relatively easy. There were definitely some issues, some adjustments for them, but they were actually wonderful, and it was not a difficult thing. The boys really adjusted very easily to having sisters, seemingly. At one point, Joshua did say, "You mean these are here? They're going to stay forever? They're never going back?" He was the youngest. He was in 5th grade at the time, but then he was a great big brother. So it was a beautiful, actually, transition, probably easier than many families experience.
Yeah, Josh was fully aware that they were going to be a part of our family, but I think it's a process. You think about, you want everything to be smooth, but we're talking about with 4 children, Betsy and myself, 2 children being adopted. That's 8 people with different personalities and stuff. And there are moments where you have to work through things to keep the process moving. And I think overall we did a pretty good job of preparing everybody as well as what we could have. Betsy had been working some in a pediatric clinic with children who had developmental issues for a variety of reasons. And a point in this is that you can't go through the loss of your birth family without some emotionally and developmental issues. And Betsy was ready for that.
So, working in a pediatric clinic office, I had worked with many families that had adopted children, and I was working with some of the parents or communicating with the parents and some of the challenges that they were facing in transitioning their children into their home. So Kevin and we actually brought a couple resources that just kind of took us through different things that we needed to do to help Val and Olio adjust to living in a family, such as just bringing them back to very early childhood nurturing experiences. I would sing them to sleep every night, even though they were almost 5 and 10 when we adopted them. We would do that, and just to give them the extra nurturing they needed. I would talk to mothers about the regrets and the things they wish that they had done differently from the get-go when they had their children. And so I took those things to heart, and those things did really help. But on top of that, I still think that our children, Valia and Olya, were probably easier than some children are that are adopted. I was discouraged from adopting from Eastern Europe by a physician that worked in our office. He had done a lot of local adoptions, and he really discouraged adoptions from Eastern Europe because of the problems with alcohol and the impact it might make on the children. He told me that adopting locally would be easier, but we were invested. Kevin felt very called by the Lord. From the age of 11, he knew he was going to do something for those Ukrainian people, and this seemed to be the answer to that. So there was no turning back.
Absolutely. So you started the paperwork the second time around for Valerie and I. How did that go?
It was a lot of work. There's no other way to put it. The background checks, they find out everything about you. They interviewed everybody in the family. Not only did we have to have the paperwork, they had to be certified by the state for international rules on those things. So it was a lot of work. Sometimes I had to go to Springfield to get things accomplished, just simply because they were complicated. And there were rules that the Ukrainian government had that didn't really match up with the U.S., so it was difficult. And even having to ask, our doctor that would be taking care of them, the Ukrainians wanted a copy of his license, which it's a little bit awkward to ask a doctor for their license and make a copy of it. So it was quite an undertaking, but in the end, definitely worth it. But it takes quite a bit of work.
Yeah. So as you said, that the adoption process is long and hard and very difficult, and it wasn't just not on you guys, but also on the family. I want to talk about what were some of the bigger difficulties that you both experienced mentally, emotionally, and physically during the adoption process.
Okay, so we arrived in Ukraine and were told that there are some real major glitches. We thought everything was in order, the paperwork was ready to go, and we got off the train and found out possibly everything was going to go south and it wasn't going to work. And we were going to be going home and our daughters were not going to be adoptable. It was not going to work. So they told us, because Olivia had medical needs, that we had 24 hours to get a notification from a doctor in the U.S. why coming to the U.S. would be beneficial for her. Because I had worked with 2 physicians at Carl, and they already knew all about Olivia. They had pictures. They understood the whole story very well. They immediately, within 8 hours, were able to fax over some good documentation. And on top of that, when everything went south, I joined up with a medical mission team out of Arizona. And on this team that I was working with, well, Kevin was trying to work on the problems within the adoption. There were physicians, cardiologists, and an ophthalmologist, and they also needed to help. So we felt like that was God's providence that we had all those things in place. They said if we did not have that, our adoption would go to the bottom of the pile and it might take 2 more years. Instead, we went home for 6 weeks, and then we get the call to come back that things had gone through.
Yeah, the legal hang-up had to do with the fact that the family, the birth family that Olivia was born into, part of the reasons why the family fell apart, well, the main reason the family fell apart, was because of a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They were ethnic Russians living in Azerbaijan, and when the war broke out, it became a less secure place, and the family became war refugees. And that's a tough position for anybody to be into. It's a big topic today in Europe, especially with what to do with war refugees, but it's very traumatic on a family. And so when they went to Ukraine, they basically were undocumented in Ukraine. I'm not sure a lot of people were aware of that, but they were not documented, so therefore, and done when they were removed from the family, left some questions about the legality of their being able to be adopted. And we had to go through the court system. And one of the things I do want to point out, at least at that time, the court system in Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine ranks very high even today in terms of corruption, and the court systems there were very corrupt, and so it was very difficult to move through that system and took a lot of time. And going back to what Betsy was saying, we were at a baseball game when we got the call and said we had to be, this was on a Wednesday evening, and we had to be in court 4 hours east of Kyiv by 10 o'clock their time, where they're 7 hours ahead, on Friday morning. And it was a difficult process to go there, and quite emotional, because we went from not sure it was ever going to work out, even at that point, to let's let's get on a plane and hurry up and get over there. Get on a train. We end up on a crowded train. We're in a compartment with some of the locals and such, and it was an interesting experience. Vodka was served very readily, which we didn't participate into, but I think when we got off the train, I think people might have thought we were imbibing with everybody else. But It was an experience, and we made it on time, got to court. We almost missed the flight in Chicago, but we made it, and here we are today.
Giving a child a home is a beautiful thing. I would lie down, put Valerie and Olivia to sleep at night. They would tell me stories as they learned how to communicate. And Valerie, within a year would talk about living in the orphanage and how she'd go to sleep and just pray to God, bring me a family. I want to be part of a family. And then she goes, and then you and Dad came. You picked me up. You took me home, and I was part of a family. That is a joy, to give a family a home to a child that needs one.
I want to say thank you for both of you guys coming into the studio to talk about your guys' adoption experience, but also our adoption story as a family as a whole. So thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Elizabeth Brooks. I hope that this story doesn't just help with bringing awareness, but also gives hope to families to understand that there is joy in adopting kids, and that there is also happiness that comes along. There might be challenges, but those challenges can be overcome.
Olivia, it's been great being here, and I love you.
Yes, Olivia. It's been a joy being your mom.